Dear friends, good afternoon. Richard and I are extremely pleased to see so many of you here today. We welcome you with much enthusiasm to this, the 7th International Conference on Self-Determination Theory. We are deeply thankful and very appreciative of the amazing amount of excellent, high-quality work done by Rashmi Kusar and her excellent team from VU Medical Center, Amsterdam. Here you will see the hardworking people who pulled this conference together. I think I'm supposed to be doing this. Sorry. Does it say anything up there? Oh, that's my title. Wow! And here you see Rashmi and her team, which is a great team. Thank you all, guys. Further, we're exceptionally thankful to Shannon Hofen-Sarasoli, director of the Center for Self-Determination Theory, for the important role she played in bringing not only this conference, but many prior conferences to fruition. So thank you, Shannon. In addition to Rashmi and Shannon, we thank Martin van Stinkist, who's probably wandering around somewhere, Richard Ryan, and Bart Sonens for their work as members of the overall program committee. They were responsible for formulating and organizing this conference, so thank you, folks. Further, we're very grateful to VU Medical Center Amsterdam for hosting the conference and being one of its sponsors. The other conference sponsors, that's Shannon. She was a little late in getting here today. Yes. And Bart, Martin, Shannon, Richard, and Rashmi. So, the other sponsors might come up now. And there you go. Australian Catholic University, Guildford Press, Ghent University, and the Center for Self-Determination Theory. The first of the SDT conferences was held just 20 years ago now. Fewer than 100 people attended, about 25 of whom gave talks. In this photo, you will see most of the speakers, and those of you who've been around for quite a while in the SDT community will recognize them. There are not very many of them who are here this particular time, but they are our long-term friends and associates. The original conference, the first conference, which was 1999, was very small, as I said, fewer than 100 people. Indeed, it was small enough that the gala dinner, which is a tradition in the SDT conferences, was held in the family home of the Ryans. That's 1999. This year, it will be Thursday evening, so you're all, of course, invited, as you know. Though small, the first conference was exceptionally exciting in many ways. most notably, at least for me, was because it seemed clear by the end of that conference that self-determination theory could indeed become a major school of psychology with an elegant theory and important applications in many domains of life. It just felt wonderful to see that as a result of those people coming together and talking together. Both Richard and I look forward to these conferences with great excitement, primarily to see so many of you who we have cared deeply for many years. It is also totally terrific for us to see those of you who are here for the first time at the SDT conference. I've met several people today for whom it's the first time, and just was wonderful to meet you and have a bit of time to chat. We hope you will find it interesting, important, and informative, that you will make new colleagues and new friends, that you will add to the SDT knowledge in whatever way is right for you, and that you will be attending more of these conferences in the future. Okay. After the initial conference at Rochester, we went to Ottawa, Canada for the second, and then to Toronto for the third, to Ghent, Belgium for the fourth. All of these pictures are of those conferences. To Victoria, British Columbia for the sixth. I left out Rochester because we don't want too much Rochester, you know, although there have been 2 conferences there. And so here we are now at the 7th. And wow, indeed, it is really so wonderful to be here. As the years have passed, the conferences have grown appreciably, such that each conference has had more people attending than prior ones, and more of the attendees have given talks and posters than was typically the case prior to that. This year we have more than, I just heard now, it's over 780 people. Wow. And they're coming from 43 countries, as someone said earlier. 185 are giving talks, 30 participants are in symposia, 278 are presenters of posters. Not only have the conferences expanded, but self-determination itself has been growing exponentially. This is just a few of the books that have self-determination theory as a central and critical element of the arguments that they're making in the book. So it gives you a sense of, to some degree at least, what's going on. We started this work by focusing on intrinsic motivation. Which is a refined concept concerning one's inherent internal motivation that can help people develop, advance, and progress toward a more satisfying, meaningful, beneficent, and loving life. We as researchers found that intrinsic motivation was an excellent place to start studying autonomy, which is what we've been doing now for about half a century. We moved on from intrinsic motivation to thinking about autonomous extrinsic motivation, integration, and basic psychological needs as critical concepts in developing the theory. As we thought about these fundamental concepts, we gradually moved forward by formulating 6 mini-theories. Cognitive evaluation theory, organismic integration theory, causality orientations theory, basic psychological needs theory, goal contents theory, and relationships motivation theory. As the many theories have been formulated and tested, the numbers of SDT publications and SDT citations have increased astronomically, with an example being shown in this slide. Since 1980, there have been 38,500 total publications, at least that we were able to find. It could be substantially more than that. And during that same time, the total number of citations that we found was 343,606. So that just gives you a sense of the degree to which this is really growing now. It's also very exciting to recognize that SDT has been moving into the field of neuroscience. So researchers are now examining the brain processes that are involved in various of the psychological phenomena that have been explored for decades, phenomena such as the undermining of intrinsic motivation. All of the many theories and many related SDT topics can be found in the new Ryan and Deci book, Self-Determination Theory, Basic Psychological Needs and Motivation, Development, and Wellness. This book is available at the Guilford table here at the conference, or at least it will be sometime. There will be times also when Rich and I are going to try and be present to sign your books if you would like. Further, SDT is being applied to many domains of life. And those discussions of those all appear in the book as well as the theories. So, SDT has become a leading theory of human motivation in the world, and the Center for SDT is critical for facilitating that. Now, what I would like to do is introduce Richard Ryan. Richard Ryan, who will provide us with an overview of SDT, emphasizing some of the new and important developments in the theory and its applications. I have known Richard for more than 40 years, and I have observed his work very closely. He is the most brilliant person I know, and it has been a total and unending delight to collaborate with him so deeply and broadly through these years. I have seen his profound insights appear whenever we needed them in order to advance the theory or to develop paradigms to answer important questions. I have observed his contributions to the applications of SDT across life's domains, and I have seen him be a tremendous support for many students, postdocs, and colleagues. I know that many of you who are here have worked with Richard at one time or another, so you can understand, you do understand what it is I'm saying. So, so, I look forward now to hearing his talk, and I thank you all very much.
Well, I don't really know how to follow Ed's introduction of me. I'm swelling with narcissistic pride and at the same time totally chagrined by the whole idea. I would like to thank Ed for all the years of collaboration we've had together. It's been an amazing thing to have an intellectual partner over time to share in these ideas and to help us move this along. And before I begin, I also want to thank Rashmi for all the work that you've done in organizing this conference. I know you've been thanked a few times today, but there's not enough thank yous for all the efforts that you've put into this. And today, I really do mean that this is going to be an incomplete overview of SDT. I took the title pretty seriously. Actually, when I first realized that I was going to do a summary for this audience of SDT, I had some feelings about it, and they were something like this. I was pretty kind of excited about it. But then I started to actually think about what I needed to do in 100 minutes, and I got more to this place. It's pretty fatiguing. Our work has grown so much, and there's so many different areas to cover. I don't think anybody could possibly do it justice in 100 minutes, as I've been asked to do here today. So part of that's because SDT has so many moving parts. We have our basic research on things like intrinsic motivation and internalization and individual differences and the sources of human wellness, but also so many important applied areas that we couldn't possibly really give justice to today, not just the work in healthcare and in education and in parenting, but also in areas like technology use and video games, many areas where we think this work is really important, and there's just no way I'm going to be able to cover all of these things. So I really do think this is going to be an incomplete talk today, and my hope is only to touch on some kind of cool areas in research at the moment, as well as some basic ideas that are really founding of the theory itself, and we'll see where that goes. I was told, by the way, when I want to change slides that you have to do right? It's like this, Rashmi? Like that, okay. There we go. So I want to begin with what I think is the most fundamental question that SDT asks, which is this question: what do people really need in order to flourish? Our work is really about how people can thrive, how they can become their best, how they can become motivated at what they do, no matter what their starting point is. And when we think about people flourishing, we don't mean about everybody succeeding or becoming A students. We mean everybody from their own starting place. How can that person flourish to the best of their capacity? So every human being has the capacity to flourish, and we want to know what is it that's going to help them flourish. Oh, no, it's this foot. There we go. And so when we think about the issue of needs, we use the term need to describe this, what it is that people really require in order to flourish. And our use of the term need is a little bit different than in some other areas of psychology. When we use that term, we mean that it's something that's essential to a living entity's capacity for growth, to its integrity, and to its wellness. And in the same way that every living being has essential ingredients required for its wellness, we think human beings not only have those physically, but they also have them psychologically. There's some things we need as psychological nutriments, which if we don't receive them, we will not be able to thrive, grow, maintain our integrity, and ever attain happiness in this world. When we think about these basic psychological needs, and the three of them I'll talk about, are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. These are things that we think are natural to us. They're part of our evolved makeup. They're, as we'll see, they're part of the structure, not only of our neurology, but also of our physiology. Not only are they natural, that means that they're also universal. These their importance cuts across cultures, cuts across developmental periods, it cuts across the domains in which we work. And so they're universal in the really strong sense. There's probably very few places where we're not going to find all three of these psychological needs being really pertinent to people's functioning. And finally, and I think this will become obvious in a lot of research, they don't have to be valued in order to be important. And I say this by way of a metaphor. It may be, for instance, that I don't like vegetables or I don't care about eating fruits, but if I don't eat any vegetables or any fruits, I might miss out on some essential ingredients, and I could be ill or fail to thrive because of it. And in the same way, there are people who don't put value on autonomy or put value on autonomy for certain subgroups within their cultures. There are some people who diminish the importance of relatedness or the importance of social support. There are people who will even say it's not important for everybody to feel efficacy and competence in the world, but we'll disagree with that. We think that whether you value them or not, or whether the people who are around you value them or not, if you don't get these needs met, you will fail to thrive in some important ways. And I think that's the evidence base that is really important to SDT. And because we have such a strong definition of basic psychological needs, we only have these three at the moment: the needs for autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And many of you in this room know we're continuously debating whether there's a fourth or a fifth need. I've been recently involved in some papers with Frank Martella looking at the viability of benevolence or beneficence as an additional need. Frank, it's not, but but it was a good try. And there are many other candidate needs that have arisen and will be tested, and maybe at some point in SDT 7 or 8 or 9 we'll have a fourth or a fifth need up here. But these are the three that we're going to focus on here. So I just want to say a few things about each of them, even though most of the people in this room, I think, know them well. The need for relatedness is the need to feel like you're belonging in a particular group, or that you're connected with the people in whatever domain you're acting in. If you're in a workplace, you want to feel like you're part of the workforce and an important member of a team. If you're in a classroom, you want to feel like you're respected and part of the class, not just by your peers, but also by your teacher. In every human setting, we want to feel the sense of connection, and we'll see that it's really important to motivation. And you get that sense of relatedness not just because people care for you, but also because you get a chance to care for them. One of the things our research shows over and over is when you get a chance to give to other people, that helps you feel increasingly connected in a sense of belonging because you've mattered in being able to contribute. The second basic psychological need that we focus on is the need for competence. And this is one where probably very few theories would disagree with the centrality of this particular variable in optimal functioning. Every major theory of motivation puts competence or effectiveness or efficacy or whatever word they're using for that at its center, because we can't be motivated to do something unless we feel like we can do it. But I think one thing that's unique about SDT is we think competence alone is not enough to have high quality motivation, because we also need this third need, which is the need for autonomy. We need to feel like we are behind and willingly engaged in the thing that we're doing. So autonomy really for us has this definition of something that you feel is self-organized and self-endorsed. When you're acting with autonomy, you're doing something that you value or that you have strong interest in. So you stand behind what you're doing, and it feels congruent for you. Because of that, you can do things wholeheartedly and put your best efforts into them, and that's one of the reasons why autonomy is associated with such positive performance outcomes. Autonomy is so important in SDT in part because it's unique to SDT, but it's also because we see functionally how big a role it plays in human development and growth. And because of its importance, I want to say a few things that autonomy is not, because it is an easily confused term. First of all, we strongly distinguish in SDT the ideas of independence and autonomy. When we use the term independence in our theory, we mean that you're not relying on other people for guidance or for help or for goods or for support. So you're doing things on your own. But in SDT, we think, well, you can sometimes be autonomously independent when you want to try something on your own, say, I would like to do this without your help or without your guidance. But we can also be autonomously dependent when we turn to other people for help or for guidance. And in fact, we think the capacity to be autonomously dependent is an important developmental asset. For instance, the healthiest of teenagers in our research are those who are not independent of their parents, but rather they're autonomously dependent on their parents. They're willing to go to their parents for advice or for guidance because they trust those parents. And typically, as our research shows, because those parents are not super controlling, but rather able to listen, hear, and then provide appropriately responsive guidance. Also important because we claim that autonomy is a universal idea, that it's also not something that's equivalent to individualism or to selfishness or to any kind of pursuit that really has to do just with self-interest. You can be autonomously individualistic if you really put the value of self above group, and that would be your inherent value. But I think it's easier and more typical that people are autonomously collectivistic, that they would put the value of group before self, and this would be their abiding value. And therefore, when they're acting collectivistically, they are doing so with full volition and full autonomy. So we don't think that we don't think that autonomy is a culturally bound idea, because whenever you're acting in accord with your abiding values and interests, you are acting with autonomy, and that is important across the world. Finally, I guess a third point is that autonomy does not also require that you're not getting orders or commands or prompts from the outside. Today, Rashmi was prompting me continuously about being here, pointing the right way, not standing up in front of the stage like this. Isn't that one of the ones? Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was supposed to stand back here. If you get guidance or commands from the outside, if you can be autonomous in following them if you concur with those demands, or you concur with the legitimacy of the authority who gives those commands. So if I believe in the value of traffic laws, for instance, then I'm willingly and autonomously stopping for the traffic guide who stops us in the street. If I believe in the value of paying taxes, then I willingly engage in paying my taxes because I know the value and importance of that for the society around me. Being autonomous means endorsing what you're doing, even if the prompt for doing it might come from the outside. And finally, autonomy is not the same thing as freedom. At least technically, when we use the term freedom in our work, we mean that you are removed from constraints. But we can remove all the constraints from a particular situation and provide people with no sense of direction, no sense of purpose, nothing to value, and nothing to be interested in, which means we would leave them without any autonomous course to pursue. So the idea of freedom is that sometimes releasing people from constraints might increase the likelihood that they would act with autonomously, but just as likely in many settings it would lead to chaos, as in this picture of classrooms here. Just removing constraints might get you not in any way a sense of autonomy, but it might get you a sense of disruption and problems. So with that said, I think I should probably go forward rather than backward. With that said, our basic theory is that these are very core need satisfactions, and when these things are satisfied, they facilitate some very deep organismic processes. One of them being intrinsic motivation, the natural propensity to take interest and be curious about the world around us. But that also fuels the propensity towards integration and internalization, because we argue in this theory that we, as human beings, we're inherently born to absorb culture around us. And we do so more willingly if we have the support of basic psychological needs. Finally, in addition, we think that when there's basic need satisfaction, because you can be more wholeheartedly engaged in it, your performance is likely to be better. And finally, and I think there's going to be a lot of evidence to this that I hope to show today, when your basic needs are satisfied, you are thriving both in terms of psychologically and in terms of your inner experience, that you're going to be a happier person and you're going to feel greater wellness. Whoops, sorry about that. So because these basic psychological needs play such an important role in self-determination theory, there's some ways in which we can think, even among the 6 existing mini-theories and the 7th and 8th ones that are to come, basic psychological need theory plays a special role, because these needs are important to intrinsic motivation. They're important to why goal contents, for instance, have different kinds of impacts on people. They're important to internalization, and they're important to relationships. So I want to begin this incomplete overview then, where we started, which was with the phenomena of intrinsic motivation. And here when I say we, I really mean Ed started here, because he's so much older than me that he began the work several decades before I came on the scene. So when we started studying intrinsic motivation, it was because it was, I think, at the time, a really understudied phenomena. Intrinsic motivation is when we do something just for the inherent enjoyment of the activity. And I guess the prototype of intrinsic motivation is children at play. Children don't need to be prompted or pushed or in any way rewarded in order to play. They play just spontaneously because they like the activity of play itself. These kids who are sitting up in the corner here who are playing with blocks, nobody has to make them play. They probably pulled these out on their own, and while they're playing, a lot of good things are happening for them. There's neuropsychological development going on. They're learning about the physics of the world. They're learning about the interpersonal atmosphere of play. They might be learning how to share, or at least how to steal from the other. All kinds of learning is going on, but that's not why they're doing it. They're doing it because phenomenally they're finding it fun to do in this moment. And I think we underestimate how important just open, spontaneous play is for all development and for learning. And intrinsic motivation, of course, isn't just a thing that's important in childhood. It's important across the lifespan. Hopefully everybody in this room, even though you're all pretty old at this point in time, at least 18, that at this point in your life, you still have some things that really interest you. And when you engage in those things that really interest you, they help to vitalize you, keep you well, keep you sharp, and keep you moving ahead. So it's important across the lifespan. And I think most developmental psychologists would agree with me on this, is that most of the things that we learn in life, not a fraction of them, most of the things we learn in life, we learn because of intrinsic motivation, not because of extrinsic motivation, not because someone has said, I will reward you for this, or you'll get paid for this, or you'll get a grade for this. No, in fact, most of the learning that goes on is happening to us all the time spontaneously. When we read the newspaper in the morning, when kids are playing, when we're engaged in sport activities, these are all places for learning. Even universities can be a place for learning sometimes if you can be intrinsically motivated at that time. And this dog here is obviously a great learner. That dog's name is Gordy, and he was a very curious dog. So it's not surprising then that intrinsic motivation is an important predictor of achievement in schools. For instance, some studies suggest that among the motivations that we study, intrinsic motivation is the most important to students' achievement, in part because of the impact it has on student engagement, which mediates this relationship. And a couple of studies I'd point you to is the recent ones by Froyland and Taylor that show some of these outcomes. And I guess in some ways that makes us sad at the same time, because our school systems across the world here really don't exploit intrinsic motivation enough. When we've looked at what happens to intrinsic motivation across school years, the graph of it looks something like this Google graph that's right up, well, I guess this is Adobe, this Adobe graph that's right here. We can see that kids start school in kindergarten with a great deal of curiosity and interest in their schoolwork. They want to learn, they want to know about the world around them, and they find out that it's less and less and less interesting as they go on. And by the time they're in 10th grade, in most countries around the world, they have a very low level of intrinsic motivation. And if you ask them why they're in school, it's either because my parents made me, or because they have some future goal that they feel like they have to be there for. But they've lost the sense that this is a place to be interested and to learn for its own sake. And so Ed and I early on thought, well, we should really study this to see if there's ways we could facilitate intrinsic motivation, particularly in classroom atmospheres, but in every sphere where it's important, in sports and work and in just general life. And so we came up with what I think is a pretty simple theory. At the time, I'm not going to go through all the propositions of it because it can be stated quite simply, which is intrinsic motivation is likely to flourish when we can engage in an activity without fearing for judgment or evaluation or being disconnected from others. So relatedness plays at least a background role in most activities that are intrinsically motivated. And very proximally, we can't be intrinsically motivated for something that we can't feel efficacy in doing. So we must feel some competence to be able to engage the activity and make progress and grow in it. And we also thought that to be intrinsically motivated, you need to feel like the activity isn't coming from yourself, or that you endorse the activity, so that any event that would make you think that somebody else is controlling or causing you to act is going to undermine your interest and your joy in that particular activity. So that's kind of the core of cognitive evaluation theory. And we started to test this, as I say, Ed started to test this back in 1940, what was it? Oh, no, we started to test this in laboratory settings really throughout the 70s. And the typical kinds of experiments we would do is to bring people into a laboratory and give them an interesting task. And we put them in one condition, for instance, in a condition where we'd say, this is a task that measures your intelligence, so we need you to work as hard as you can on this, because we'll be using this to evaluate your intelligence. This would be a pressure on the person. an evaluative pressure on them. And then in another condition, we would say this is an experimental task that we're using to look at people's cognitive activity. This is not an evaluation of your intelligence, but just do the best you can do on this task. So not putting pressure on them toward an outcome. We'd have them do the activity, and then after they finished that activity, we'd tell everybody, oh, you did really well at that activity, so nobody was feeling like they were being negatively evaluated. And then we would leave them alone in a room for some period of time with the activity and telling them, oh, you can do more of this if you want to while we're gone, or you could read the magazines over in the corner, or you could do nothing, but we'll be back in 10 minutes. And during that time, when they thought they weren't being evaluated and no one was watching, we were watching. We were looking through small holes in the wall or through one-way mirrors or through other devices to find out what they did when they thought nobody was any longer controlling them. And we assumed that if they went back to the activity with that interest and that curiosity and persisted at it, that this was a behavioral sign of their intrinsic motivation. But if they desisted as soon as we left the room or avoided the activity, that this showed an undermining of the motivation that they might have otherwise had. So we used that to determine a lot of factors that affected intrinsic motivation. I just put some of them up here. We found that in laboratory settings that where you didn't put people under pressure, where you gave them choice about how they do an activity, where you don't micromanage their behavior, you let them choose their own goals, where you focus on the interest rather than the evaluative qualities of a task, that these things all increase people's intrinsic motivation. And on the other hand, when you pressure them, when you tell them how to do things, when you give them a deadline, even though it's a deadline that's more time than they possibly could use, the very fact of doing these things has them feeling controlled, and it undermines their interest in that activity, and therefore they would be less likely to engage in the free choice behavior associated with intrinsic motivation. I'm sorry, Rashmi, you said to stand over here? Yes, I'm sorry. I didn't follow my commands very well. So. Similarly, we also looked at competence-relevant issues, and of course, when you give people optimal challenges, what we mean by optimal challenges is challenges they can actually succeed at, not things that put them on the edge of their chair or make them feel like they're using the maximum ability they have, but tasks where they can feel like, yeah, I can do this. I think I know what to do next. So that sense of being able to succeed at a thing increases your interest and your joy in activity. So giving that kind of feedback, focusing on the effort or their particular accomplishments. When you praise them, that could increase intrinsic motivation. Generally, positive feedback increasing intrinsic motivation. On the other hand, when you put people in situations where they feel like they can't do the task, where they can't really feel successful at it, where they get negative feedback, this is going to undermine their intrinsic motivation. I also would want to point out in our experiments where we gave people no feedback, this would typically also undermine their intrinsic motivation because they don't have a sense of efficacy in what they're doing. So these experiments then, I think, have held up pretty well, and we can fast forward 30 or 40 years further. We can see that now meta-analyses are supporting many of the early propositions we had about cognitive evaluation theory. And this one I bring up, which is by Erica Patel and her colleagues. She did a meta-analysis on the effects of choice on intrinsic motivation and related outcomes, and I think the meta-analysis bears out many of these points of cognitive evaluation theory, finding that when you give people choice over their activity or the goal within their activity, that this enhances their intrinsic motivation, it increases people's efforts, it increases performance on tasks, particularly some types of tasks, and increases their sense of perceived competence. They found in their meta-analysis that these effects are stronger for children than they are for adults, and they also found that these effects were stronger if you didn't follow your choice manipulation with rewards. So these are all things that I think fit well with early CET. I want to give you kind of a concrete example of choice and the impact choice can have, and I love this example. It comes from an experiment that was done by Paloma Dominguez and her group, and she's a dietitian. And she had read some of the articles about choice and motivation, and she thought, I wonder if we can use this to get kids to eat their vegetables. And so in this particular set of experiments, she had kids come into a lab, and she had already assessed what children's preferred vegetables were. And so she took two highly preferred vegetables that children had and had them in 3 conditions for a lunch meeting. When the kids came in one condition, she took one of those 2 preferred vegetables and she said, here's your vegetable for today. And she put that on their plate. In another condition, she took both preferred vegetables and put them on their plates and said, you can eat as much or a little of these as you like. And in a third condition, she said, which of these two vegetables would you like? And then they took that vegetable and put it on the child's plate. So there's two choice conditions there, and there's one no choice condition. And then they observed how much the children ate of those vegetables. Now you have to remember these were all the children had the same preferred vegetables here. So the condition on the left-hand side here is the no choice condition. Children ate substantially less of the vegetables when they didn't have a choice. And this is just the impact of choice. This is not the impact of the vegetables or the situation. It's the fact that if you get to choose something, you are more likely to take interest in it and to find preference in it. And so if you want to get your kids to eat your vegetables, give them some choice over to whatever you got in the refrigerator. It turns out that these experiments don't work that well for kids under 6, but they seem to be being replicated for kids who are older than that. The very fact of choice can increase performance because it helps people increase their engagement. And this is just some recent studies that have been done in the motor learning sphere where people given choice on tasks like what color ball to use in putting or other things that had to do with choice around your stabilometer test, that their performance would be better at those tasks as a function of having had choice, even though it didn't matter for performance itself. The fact of choice leads to more ownership of the activity, more sense of initiative, and then that shows up in engagement and then a faster learning. This is even showing up in some new or relatively recent neuropsychological experiments. This is an experiment by Manga and Ma, and they were using ERPs in this. And since I'm an old ERP fan myself, I really like this experiment. So they had people engage in a cognitive task where they gave one half of the people choice and other people not choice. And in this cognitive task, you saw that the people who were in the choice condition could outperform the people in the no choice condition, in part because they showed more preference for the onset of the stimulus, which was this first, the stimulus preceding negativity. So your brain is opening up to receive the activity as it comes in. And then people doing this task, whenever there was an error or a discrepant feedback, they had a larger reaction to this, meaning they're paying more attention to the feedback that's coming back for them. And these things show up in better performance on the task itself. So we can look at this in many different ways, and we could go on with choice experiments, but we'd also found in these early experiments that rewards, when used in certain ways, could undermine people's motivation because they could feel controlling to others. And this is particularly rewards where you say, I will give you this for doing that, where you see that there's a clear contingency between you're doing the activity and me giving you this reward for it. And again, this is another meta-analysis that was done a while back at DC. Rich Kessner and I published this in 1999 in the midst of some controversies about this issue, which mostly have evaporated now. But one of the things that we saw in here is we have never believed that all rewards undermine intrinsic motivation, only those that are used controllingly. So things like unexpected rewards don't undermine. Things like competence praise, which is sometimes called a verbal reward, typically will not undermine unless you're praising somebody in a controlling way. So this literature has borne out pretty well. And I would say that there are really cool examples almost every year of undermining effects that are worthy of a talk like this. But this, again, is one of my favorites. And this is a study that was done at the Max Planck Institute by Warneken and Tomasello. And Warneken and Tomasello are evolutionary psychologists, and they have the strong belief that our pro-social behavior, our altruism, our desire to help each other is intrinsically motivated, that we find inherent enjoyment in helping other people. And they started to show this by looking at toddlers as young as 12 and up through 20 months and showing that spontaneously kids will help adults when adults are in some sort of distress. So if adults drop papers on the floor or can't open a door, infants, or toddlers rather, will toddle over and help them out, pick up the papers or get the door for them. They did so at 90% of the time in their laboratory studies, showing I guess itself prima facie evidence for the idea that this is intrinsically motivated. But they thought, well, if it's intrinsically motivated, then it should be undermined by giving external rewards for doing it, if the paradigms that are out there hold up. And so they did an experiment where they had 20-month-old toddlers in a laboratory setting, and they had adults who dropped papers on the floor or couldn't open a door, and then they looked and then they had kids who came over to help them. And when kids came over to help them, they did one of three things to them. In one condition, when the child came over to help, the person who was helped did nothing, said nothing, just took the papers or just closed the door, whatever, but did not respond. In another condition, they responded with what we would call non-controlling praise. They said, thank you for doing that. I guess kind of what we would commonly do. In a third condition, they said, thank you for doing that. And then they handed the child a ball. They said, you get this for having done that. So they gave them a preferred toy, which actually operated a machine that was in the corner of the laboratory and the kids knew about when they helped. Now, if you come from a behavioristic view, you think, well, rewarding them for helping is only going to increase the sense that they should be helping and that they will help in the future. But when they brought these three groups of toddlers back into the laboratory setting in a subsequent occasion and adults started dropping things on the floor, two groups continued to help at the high rates. The ones who nothing had happened for, they continued to help 90% of the time. Those who got the non-controlling praise continued to help a non-significantly different 88% of the time. But those who were in the group that got rewarded for helping now helped 56% of the time, I believe it was. A significant drop-off in helping. Now, those of us who study pro-social behavior know this is a phenomenon we can repeat with adults all the time. When we start to reward adults for doing what we would normally do and being helpful to one another or doing altruistic things within our organization, what we've seen over and over again is that those rewards tend to undermine people's helping in any other sphere except the one where they're getting rewarded. They have bad spillover effects, negative undermining effects. So this phenomenon we can see here with toddlers persists throughout our lifetime. In fact, there's all kinds of really cool examples out there of how rewards can have long-term undermining effects. Here's just another one on parental practices to get your kids to study in high school. And in this particular study, the investigators showed that parents who frequently rewarded their children for grades in school had children who, when they got to university or college, took easier rather than harder courses. So we can see here an undermining effect of kids' desire to do the hard work after they're no longer being directly rewarded by parents. Another study that came out recently by Arlen Moeller and Ken Sheldon showed that athletes who would receive certain kinds of scholarships for their sport activity in college were years later less interested in playing their sport. They weren't less interested in sports in general, but they were less interested in playing their sport. Another possible long-term undermining effect. So these things show up in real life in many different places. And by the way, I want to add parenthetically, we're going to make a provision so that you can have all the slides from this deck. So they're going to be on the conference website. So you can, since I'm going through studies very quickly, I think. Getting back to what we know about intrinsic motivation, we had said a long time ago that negative feedback undermines intrinsic motivation. And here's another recent analysis that Carlton Fong is the lead author on. This one had 78 studies in it. And again, I think it supports many of the CET early formulations. First of all, positive feedback facilitates intrinsic motivation more than negative feedback, as we would expect. But interestingly, no feedback also has undermining effects. It's no better than negative feedback in this particular analysis because, again, if you're doing an activity and you don't get any feedback, that's not feeding any sense of efficacy or competence in what you're doing. In this meta-analysis, too, we see that it's better when feedback is based on a clear criteria. I think that rather than what we're doing so often in life, which is kind of normative feedback that has no criteria at all, and it's better when it's personally delivered. So negative feedback, of course, can be undermining, but it doesn't always have to be undermining. And I think we all know that when you're trying to build a skill or you're trying to be good at something that you might be intrinsically motivated to do, sometimes you need negative feedback. You need somebody to help you find out what you're doing not right. And recent experiments, I think, are picking out even better that we can have what we would call informational negative feedback, feedback that provides you information that we would think of as efficacy relevant that will increase your intrinsic motivation or at least help you maintain it. And this is a set of studies that I just particularly like that really have to do with what's called change-oriented feedback. And this is when, for instance, a coach might come up to you and, as you're a batter in baseball, say, with your elbows hanging a little low, lift your elbow up. That's going to help you get a better hit. In a sense, that's negative feedback, but it's also efficacy related. It's particular to performance, and it's also a kind of attention that's making you feel like you matter here. And so we can see here that change-oriented feedback is associated positively with self-determined motivation or autonomous motivation, and with well-being, and with lower negative affect, and with better self-esteem, and with better need satisfaction, because it's informational rather than controlling or demeaning or amotivating in nature. The science of intrinsic motivation, I think, is moving on, and one of the things that Ed mentioned is that there's increasing neurological work on the underpinnings of intrinsic motivation and really autonomous motivation more generally. And I particularly here want to call out Ugo Lee and John Marshall-Reeve for some of the, I think, groundbreaking work that they've done in this area. Some of the things that they've been showing about intrinsic motivation, first of all, something we should expect, which is all brain activity is networked activity. It really has to do with how the system is operating at every given time. But in some of their investigations, they've been able to deduce that when you have the initiative and desire or interest in doing an activity, that's going to involve your anterior insular cortex, and you're going to need activation there. That if you can engage in the activity and you can get positive feedback, or you can enjoy the activity, that's going to activate the striatal areas of your brain where we're sensitive to rewards and to pleasure. And if you're having this sense of initiative and the sense of pleasure at the same time, this is part of the underpinning for the cognitive engagement, which we would see in the lateral prefrontal cortical areas. So we can see that the system of the brain is operating in several locales during intrinsically motivated activities. And as we understand these temporal processes more specifically, we're going to be able to do even more careful experiments on what are the things that interfere with or progress intrinsic motivation in different tasks. But of course, I want to get back to where we started in this. The reason that we were first interested in this whole phenomenon of intrinsic motivation is because we thought, let's bring more of this to the classroom. Let's find the conditions under which this is really going to be optimized. And our early work suggested that when people are autonomy supportive, that this is going to enhance intrinsic motivation, and when people are controlling with you, this will diminish intrinsic motivation. And this has shown up in many experiments around the world. And I just put one up here just as illustrative. This was a set of studies, including a longitudinal study that was headed by Young-Shim Yang. And in this particular path diagram, this is Korean high school students. You can see that when they experience their teachers as autonomy supportive versus controlling, this is more need satisfying, helps support their sense of autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And this in turn is related to enhanced intrinsic motivation in the classroom. We can also see this in sports, and I'm going to call out another earlier study here that was done by Kimberly Bartholomew and Nikos Doumanis and Cecile Thorgerson Doumanis, and they let me also be part of this team at the time, although I did probably the least work of the crew here. This was a set of studies that was done with UK athletes of all levels, all the way from amateur level up to elite level. And what they were interested in is how controlling coaching behaviors or autonomy supportive coaching behaviors would impact in a bright way, support basic psychological needs, and when controlling, thwart basic psychological needs, and then have impact on outcomes. And one reason this is a really important particular study, or this and its companion study, is this was one of the first set of studies where we were really bringing out the bright side and the dark side of need satisfaction, that it's not just about getting it satisfied, but also the harms done by having needs thwarted. And you can see here that athletes who experienced their coaches as controlling had more need-thwarting experiences, and this was associated with lowered positive affect, more negative affect, and more burnout. And with a subset of the athletes that were in this study, the more elite athletes, they were able to take a mouth swab before they went on to practice or training. And here they got an assay for secretory immunoglobulin A. And this is something we secrete in the mucosa of our mouth when we're under stress. Probably right now, I have a lot of this going in my mouth, but nobody's swabbing it, so it's okay. It's okay. No, okay. And what we can see here is that those people who are experiencing controlling coaching, who are ending up with a need-thwarting experience, have more of this secretion, which is really their body saying, you're under stress right now, and I'm trying to protect you. So we can see, even at a physiological level, how these psychological variables are affecting us. So I want to go on with more about the importance of autonomy, competence, and relatedness in supporting intrinsic motivation, but maybe motivation more generally. So I want to move to the second type of motivation that's really central to us, which is extrinsic motivation. And again, when Ed and I were starting in this field, people typically saw intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation as opposites of one another, one being good and one being bad. But I think we quickly had the idea that extrinsic motivation isn't all bad. Many of the things we do that are not intrinsically motivated, not interesting in their own right, are still things that we find value in, think are important, and do quite willingly. And so we needed a model that accommodated that, I guess you could say, intuition. And so we developed this model of a taxonomy of human motivation that we thought was more encompassing. So I just want to spend a minute on this model because it's important to what I'll talk about next. But in general, this is a model that shows what we call the continuum of autonomy that goes from very controlling forms of motivation, such as external regulation, all the way up to very autonomous forms of extrinsic motivation, which we'll call integration. And I want to begin down here with the most heteronymous of these forms of motivation, which is external regulation. And this is when we do something because somebody else in the world is controlling the rewards or the punishments that are out there, and we are complying with those things. This is a very, very powerful form of motivation. And so there's no part of SDT that has ever said that external regulation is not powerful or effective in the short run. It can be extremely effective in the short run. If I have a big enough stick or a tall enough pile of money, I can get almost anybody to do anything. It's a really sad statement about us, but it's also the truth, which is that if we have strong external controls, we can get people to act. So the trouble with external regulation is not its potency, but rather the fact that it's hard to maintain over time. If you don't keep the stick behind somebody who you've motivated with the stick, they stop running. If you stop paying the person who you've been motivating through pay, they stop being motivated and they stop engaging the activity. So the problem is not its potency, it's what we call its maintenance and transfer capacities, which is that you have to typically keep escalating the external regulators if you're going to maintain this kind of behavior. It's also associated with a lot of rebellion and reactance and side effects and crowding out and collateral damage that we can get to as further problematic features of it. Next on this continuum is what we call introjection. And introjection is represented in many different kinds of psychological states, including when we get ego involved in something or when our self-esteem is on the line. When we feel like we should do something or we won't be a worthwhile person if we don't do it. These are all kinds of statements you'd make if you were in an introjected form of motivation. And in introjection, we're really focused on approval for our self-approval and the approval of others, because this is typically how we've gotten this into our system in the first place. The roots of introjection tend to lie in conditional parental regard or conditional regard of other people that we then internalize and now conditionally regard ourselves as a function of what we do. So like external regulation, introjection is a very powerful form of motivation. Since so many people in this room are highly educated people, I suspect that most of you have experienced a lot of introjection just personally, that you've been through periods of time where you needed to achieve well or you couldn't feel good about yourself, and this was a hard driving force for you. It's not that it's not powerful, it's that it has fragility to it. So one of the problems with introjected motivation is it's hard to sustain yourself over the long haul with this as your predominant form of motivation, especially when things go wrong, because that's when you start to feel bad about yourself, start to feel debilitated, start to feel depressed, start to lose the energy that it requires in order to keep succeeding. So this is a hard one to maintain, and even if you're very successful and you are floating on some kind of narcissistic bubble, it's an easy one to burst. And when it bursts, there goes your motivation as well. Still another form of motivation that's extrinsic is what we call identification. And here again, you're not doing something because it's fun or it's interesting. You're doing it because you understand its worth or its value. And identification is now really the first one of these forms of motivation that we call relatively autonomous, because typically when you're identified with an activity, you understand its importance and you're doing it willingly, even if you do know it's not enjoyable. And I do want to say, however, identification is often not fully autonomous in the following way, which is I can have an identification with a particular worth of something that's not very well integrated with the other identifications I have. Identifications can be compartmentalized or walled off from others or sometimes defensive. So I can say, oh, I'm very much behind grades in school, and then in another moment not really realize that those are the same things that are punishing my children or those of somebody else. Or I could be very much behind a political belief as long as I don't think too deeply about the cost to the environment or other things about that. So we typically might have strong identifications. We feel willing to do something in the moment in accord with those, but unless they're well integrated with our other identifications, they aren't fully autonomous and we can't be wholehearted. And this is why we have the category of integration. Now, it's been hard to measure integration in self-reports. Typically, self-report measures don't discriminate well between identified and integrated regulations. And part of that is because if you're even compartmentalized in your identification, you're going to say, yeah, that agrees with all my other ones too. In other words, you'll compartmentalize even the answer to that question. But nonetheless, there is a state of integration. It's what every clinician is looking for when they're interviewing their clients. It's what each of us knows about when we're fully congruent with what we're doing. This is the state of integration, and it's the highest form of autonomous extrinsic motivation in this system. So we see these things as forming a continuum. So they're each unique types of motivation with their own characteristics. Introjection is not the same as external regulation in its experience, and neither of those is like identified. But they do have a systematic relation with one another, is that they vary systematically along a continuum of autonomy, such that external regulation is the least autonomous motivational form, introjected slightly more autonomous because there's some of the self-willingness in it, identification even more so, integration fully autonomous, and obviously intrinsic motivation also being autonomous. And so even in the early 80s, we posited a simplex structure in the mathematical relation between these types of motivation. And the simplex structure, again, is a pretty simple idea. It's just that those things that are next to each other along this continuum should be more highly correlated than any relationship between variables that are not adjacent to one another. So external regulation should be highly correlated with introjection, and it should be more correlated with introjection than it is with identified, integrated, or intrinsic. So that's been held up pretty well across all kinds of different analytical approaches now. And of course, recently we've had a whole spate of psychometric investigations into the continuum of autonomy. And I think all of these are really important because we still have some struggles over how we should best summarize scores for autonomy, how we might think about the relationships. But when I look across all these different methods, I see a lot of convergent data for the simplex model. For instance, in the meta-analysis that was done by Howard, Gagne, and Bureau, recently they found, I think, good support in the meta-analysis for the simplex model in general. They did see some issues between identification and integration in terms of whether they can be distinguished in factor analysis. But I still would repeat to you, they can be distinguished phenomenologically, even if we haven't yet gotten to the measurement point where we're clearing them to each other. I think that's one way we've shown that. I got involved with a group of, I guess you'd say they were all French-Canadians, all pretty crazy French-Canadians on there. So David L'Italien was on there, Alex Morin, Marilyn Gagne, Robert Vallerand, and Gaëtan Lossier were co-authors on this. I was the only not French. Chantal, you would appreciate this. I was in a minority for a change. We did a bifactor analytic approach to this. And the bifactor analysis, again, showed that, as we would expect, there was a global factor for autonomy, and the loadings of the S factors were perfectly ordered in accord with the simplex idea, I think, giving support to it. I think Ken Sheldon and others found some strong support for this. In other words, if you look across all these different methods, whether we're using LPA or bifactor analysis or traditional factor analysis or circumplex models, each of them is still coming back to this ordered continuum of autonomy. So I think lots of support for this psychometrically. We see this support in almost all the different kinds of experiments we do, and I saw Martin Standage here earlier today, so I wanted to make sure I presented one of his studies without putting his name on it here. And so this is a Martin Standage and company study. And in this study, they were just asking people, why do you exercise? And they used the SDT continuum for those answers. And some people were externally regulated for exercise. They were doing it because of pressure from others. Some were introjected. They just felt good about themselves when they did and bad when they didn't. Identified as you understood its value for your health. And then some, I think, really strange people thought exercise was fun. That's the intrinsic motivation group. And then he had people wear an Act-A-Heart device for the next period of time. and was pretty accurately tracking how much physical activity you did over the next week time. And you can see here the correlations between people's motivations for exercise and whether they actually exercised over that next week. And you can really see at the bottom here the autonomous motivations, the intrinsic and identified, are reliably accounting for people's actual exercise, where controlled motivations are not. We can see this in other populations as well. This is a group of patients with schizophrenia, and those of you who've worked in this domain know that physical activity can be a really important part of treatment for people with severe mental illness. And here we see the same pattern, which is more autonomous reasons for engaging in physical activity are associated with more both moderate and vigorous physical activity in this population. Another recent study that I really kind of liked in the same sphere with exercise was done in Monterrey, Mexico. And here they were looking at the stages of change model and associating it with the various motivations as we use it along the SDT continuum. And what this data basically shows is that if you're a person who isn't yet exercising, you're a pre-contemplator is what they call it in stages of change, you can see that all the motivations are kind of glommed together there. But as you move up in terms of increasing activity, you go to contemplation, you go to preparation to actually be an exerciser. That's where I've been for many years, by the way. I'm preparing to be an exerciser. It's going to happen one of these days. And then there's an action phase, and then once you start exercising, then you get into a maintenance phase of exercise. So these are all, I guess you could say, more active levels of actually being an exerciser, and you can see the more autonomous forms of motivation, intrinsic, integrated, and identified are the ones that are associated with actually being in a maintenance phase of exercise. So these are just, in the exercise sphere, ways of showing the importance of this continuum of autonomy. But we can look at it in other spheres too as well, and I was just choosing some arbitrary ones for today's talk. This one is a study that was done by John Wang and colleagues. I know when she is here today, and so is Bi-Ling, I think, is on here. Yep, and here they're looking at motivation for engaging in mathematics. And most of us think mathematics is not for many students anyway, not the most intrinsically motivated activity that they could be engaged in. And what you see here is that the motivations form a simplex, as we'd expect. And they also did a latent profile analysis on this, and they found two profiles that had a relatively high degree of autonomy, but one in particular, which is profile 3 here. And those people who had more autonomy for engaging in mathematics, put in more hours, showed more effort, had more value for mathematics. And so these are things that are really showing that this matters in terms of people pursuing mathematics, also felt more competence. Another analysis that was done recently by Vinberg and colleagues, we're looking at the variables across different theories of motivation that are the most predictive of people having positive attitudes towards mathematics. And you see that the very top one on here is our measures of intrinsic motivation and identified motivation. Those are the most predictive of actually positive feelings toward mathematics. And you can see another number of other SDT variables here in the top 10 VIPs, but the motivation residing at the top. We can look at other domains as well, and this is one that just came out in the literature. I don't even know if the article's in print yet, but Veronica Huda sent it to me that she did with her colleagues here, Camo and others. And they were looking at motivation for studying music. And so they developed a scale that measures a motivation for studying music, external regulation, like your parents make you do it, introjection, identified, et cetera. And you can see here that there's a perfect simplex model that underlies the intercorrelations between those various factors. But I think what's really interesting is what that predicts, and these are some of the results from this study that's coming out in motivation and emotion. You can see here that, and I'm just going to pick out a couple of things here, the child's report of taking interest in the mundane aspects of instrument practice is negatively correlated with amotivation and uncorrelated with external regulation, but quite strongly correlated with identification and with intrinsic motivation. In other words, paying attention to the hard part is something you do when you're more internalized. If we look here at the parents' report of giving tangible rewards to children for practicing their music, you see it's correlated here with external regulation is the only significant correlation. It's not enhancing children's intrinsic motivation or identification with this activity as some other investigators claim it should. So I'm not going to pore over this table. I think it's a really interesting table. It shows you many different qualities of what you would want in a child who's engaged in music that are coming about to the degree that they have autonomous rather than external forms of motivation. We can see this in the workplace, and I know that Stefan is here in this conference today, so he can explain his work probably much better than I can, but I choose this particular graph because it shows all the different types of motivation in association with job satisfaction and some activities that I would call organizational altruism. You can see that identified and intrinsic motivation are highly correlated with job satisfaction, whereas introjection, external regulation, amotivation with regard to work, quite negatively correlated. A similar pattern for turnover and tension. These bottom variables having to do with civic virtue and altruism really have to do with people going the extra mile in their workplaces, the knowledge sharing, the doing the things that might be good for the company that aren't within your particular job description. And you can see that here too, the people who are more internalized in their motivation for work are the people who are more likely to engage in these kinds of activities. So across many domains, and I could go on with many other particular concrete examples, we know more autonomous motivation is functional in both for performance and for sustained engagement, and also for people's well-being and positive experience while they're engaged in the activity. So we're always trying to think of what are the methods through which we can bring people from the left side of this continuum up to the right side of this continuum when they're engaged in an activity that has merit. And so to do that, we think, well, we go back to our basic theory, which is we support their basic psychological needs. I want to spend a couple minutes here talking about how it is that we support people's basic psychological needs when we're doing so by reviewing each of the needs and some of the, I would say, cardinal ingredients in supporting them. So this first slide here has to do with what are the central ingredients in autonomy supportive interactions. And if I were to name one thing that is the most important if I'm going to support the autonomy of one of my employees or one of my students or one of my children or anybody, is first of all, understand their point of view. When I'm asking somebody to do something, I should understand, like, what's their reaction to it? How are they viewing that? And taking just a moment to apprise yourself of their point of view can reveal so much. One of the reasons why taking the other person's point of view is important to autonomy is, first of all, it does show them respect. It does show them that you care about their initiative. But it also turns out to be really helpful as a motivator, because when you start to pay attention to people's internal frame of reference, you also find out what are the obstacles as they perceive them. What are the things that might be in the way? What are the values that this might conflict with? What are the things that you didn't understand about their situation could come to the fore in this? And this helps you problem solve with them on how to be more effective at what they're doing. So this has this double benefit of not only helping them feel ownership for the activity and respect from you, but also it helps you diagnose any obstacles that might be in the way of further motivation and support competence and relatedness. Another ingredient is that when people are engaged in activity, they like to feel ownership of it. That means let them have as much input as they can. Seek their input. Find out from them what they think about how to go about the activity. First of all, a lot of times people will know a better way than you do, and you learn something about how to do it better. But even if not, this helps them to take that ownership and feel that sense of initiative and be more fully engaged in the activity. When we're engaged in supporting somebody's autonomy for an activity, if we have availability of choices, we give them those choices. We give them options that feel meaningful to them so that they can pursue the task in a way that they most see fit. Again, encouraging that sense of ownership, but also many times they will find a fitting way that's more effective than the one we might have assigned to them. Whenever people are resisting doing something, this is part of taking their internal frame of reference is we want to understand what that resistance is. So we would say embrace that resistance, listen to that resistance, ask people, what is the issue? What's in the way of this? I'd really like to understand that. So by not only taking the frame of reference and understanding the resistance, but empathizing with it, this helps people feel less conflict about engaging in the activity, and they're more likely to internalize the activity if they feel that empathy from you. Of course, it goes with all of SDT that if we're supporting somebody's autonomy, we stay away from controlling rewards and controlling pressures and shoulds and musts and have-tos. Instead, a more inviting language of bringing people into an activity with us to engage in. And then the last one I want to finish on is something that I think we often forget, that if we want somebody to engage in an activity willingly, they have to have a good reason for doing it. So if we don't provide them with a rationale for why they need to do something, how could they do it autonomously? I ask everybody in the room to think about how many times would you do an activity if you didn't have a good reason for doing it and it wasn't fun? We need a good reason in order to willingly engage in something. So a good reason is something to be there. Now, I was working on a project the other day. We were watching classroom teachers in a math class, and the students were like, why do we have to learn this thing? And the teacher gave a rationale. It's going to be on the test. That was the rationale. Now, I'm not going to show that particular study here, but there's some data out that shows that when you give that rationale, it feels controlling, it undermines autonomy, and it leads to worse performance on a math test than if you didn't do that at all. But partly it's because it's not a rationale. It's an external pressure. When we want to ask somebody to do something, we probably should have a good reason behind it. And if we don't have a good reason, we probably shouldn't ask them to do it. And so a lot of times, when we're counseling in parenting or we're looking at teaching and people are saying, well, my child just won't do this thing, we say, well, why do you want them to do that? And a lot of times parents will go like, oh, I don't know. My parents made me do it. That's, again, not a reason. So coming up with a good reason means we have to think about what we request of other people and make sure it is something that has a rationale and a purpose to it. And then when it has that, we can communicate that, and people will be more likely to get on board. So I just want to give, before I move on to the other needs supports, I just want to give an example of another study that I really like that's not based on self-report, but parent observation that illustrates some of these things. And this is not my study. It's by Loren and Jojame. And it was a study of toddlers' internalization. And in this study, they had kids at 2 years old come into a laboratory setting and do a pickup task with parents, so picking up toys, and I think there was a toy prohibition. And they looked at the parents' behaviors in that experimental setting as to whether they were autonomy supportive or controlling. Autonomy supportive settings, ingredients here would be they gave the child some kind of choice while they were going through the activity. They gave them a rationale for why the toys needed to be picked up. They encouraged them in a positive way through the activity, either by doing it with them or singing a song as they were doing it. So they engaged the child in a way to get them to volitionally engage in the pickup tasks. And in a more controlling parenting, they would have done this in obviously a more controlling way with pressure or bossing or shoulds, etc. So then they brought these same kids back into a laboratory setting a year and a half later and looked at and then had them engage in the same task. And the autonomy supportive style of the parents a year and a half earlier predicted how willingly the child picked up toys at age 3.5. It's called committed compliance, that sense of getting on board with what the parent is asking you to do. This is a real sign of internalization. One of the reasons I like this experiment in particular is because it shows that there are different qualities of internalizing. You can get kids to comply, but in a way that's not autonomous. But the happiest family lives are those where your children are willingly engaged in the activities that your family is doing. I want to move on to competence. If we want to support people's competence, then there are a number of elements to that as well. But the first one is we think that if we want people to engage in activities in a willing way, we should design activities so they can feel successful at them. So we scaffold activities so that the dominant experience when you're engaged in the activity is one of success. Not the periodic experience, not the sometimes I get it. I get it almost all of the time. I want everybody in this room to think about our classroom experiences for so many kids where they walk in every day and they have a series of micro failures that they're experiencing across the day. And then we wonder why they're not engaged in school, why they don't find interest in this. When instead of designing activities so that every child can feel like they're progressing and that they can succeed, we're instead normatively designing activities so many kids are getting negative feedback that's not because they're not engaged in optimally challenging activities that give them this dominant experience. whenever we want to design an activity, whether it's in a workplace or a sport field or a classroom or just a game experience itself, we want to create that scaffolding so people can mostly feel successful as they engage in it. And once in a while, run into a challenge that really engages them more fully. So we're not in the same place as, for instance, our friend Mike Csikszentmihalyi is in. We don't think optimal challenge in the strong sense is the thing that produces intrinsic motivation. It does occasionally produce flow, but if you keep people in a flow state, they get exhausted and they're less intrinsically motivated to engage in that activity subsequently. So there's a limit to flow as a feed-in to intrinsic motivation. If you want people to feel competence, too, feedback should be informational. It should be, and as I was speaking about before, it should be something that helps them feel effective at what they're doing and gives them information on how to grow and gain new skills. And when we praise people to help competence, it's because we're really praising some accomplishment they actually did. Rather than through false praise or inflated praise, it's praising specific accomplishments or specific efforts that we see them putting forth. Empty praise or praise given for something that you didn't really accomplish actually has a backfiring effect for most people who are being motivated. They know they're being manipulated when you give them empty praise. And so it doesn't work. So praise has to be authentic in this sense for it to work. And we studiously avoid the idea of comparisons with others. We don't praise people on their ability or how good they are compared to other people, but rather for what it is that they're doing, either relative to what they've done in the past or just the efficacy that they're showing in the moment. And finally, when we're supporting relatedness, the most important part of relatedness is conveying respect and care for the people who are around us. That sounds so simple, but it's so rarely done in the places where we're working or where we're learning or where we're engaged in sport activities. When we have that sense of relatedness, it's because we feel significant and meaningful within the atmosphere where we're in. And so that means that when I'm running into problems on the sport field or I'm running into problems in my workplace, that means the coach or the manager doesn't come at me with criticism and humiliation, but comes at me with care and concern and helpfulness. This is a way of both helping my competence, but also conveying relatedness and that I matter in some way or another. Well, if we took a single item out of our questionnaires, we found in a few different studies that one of the strongest predictors of classroom engagement is the answer to the item, "My teacher likes me." So when students say, "My teacher likes me," they're more intrinsically motivated and more internalized to behave in that classroom. And I would like you to notice it's not, "I like my teacher." It's, "My teacher likes me." And that means that this is something that can be conveyed by the teacher who smiles at each student who comes into the day or takes a moment in each part of the day to ask that child how they're doing. My wife Miriam was showing me a YouTube film the other day where I think it was a teacher in Iran who had a system where every child who came into the classroom, she had a choice that they could do. They could tap a heart and they would get a hug, or they could tap a fist bump and they'd get a fist bump, or they could tap a hand and get a handshake. I thought it was a beautiful message to these children as they came into the classroom, because it says, "I care about you, and I'm also giving you a choice about how we can show that with each other." What a way to start the day for a child who comes into a room. So conveying this sense of you matter in this atmosphere is hugely motivating, and every student and every employee and I think every athlete wants to work harder for the coach, the teacher, the manager, who they know cares about them. Now, a lot of our research is showing that relatedness is also about opportunities to give, not just to get from other people. So it's being able to care for others. And when you can care for others, you really now feel connected to the group. So it's a really important thing. Now, we emphasize autonomy support in a lot of our work because autonomy support, in a way, if you really engage autonomy support, you will be supporting all three basic psychological needs. As I said before, when you take the internal frame of reference of the other person, you're probably going to get a sense if they have issues with relatedness, or you're going to get a sense if they're having issues of competence. And so you'll be able to be responsive to those things. So when we assume that internal frame of reference, we're not just building relatedness, we're also being aware of how we can support the other issues that might be in the person's way motivationally. Now, Gavin Slemp is here. He showed a meta-analysis today on teachers, and this is one that I got to collaborate with him and his team on, where we were looking at a meta-analysis of autonomy support in the workplace that I think shows these points very well. So this is a meta-analysis that involved quite a few studies, and I think it was 79 studies or something like that that was in that. The N in this particular path diagram is 5,667 in this N. You can see that the path diagram here is one where leadership autonomy support is predictive of all three basic needs being satisfied. So in the way that I was just saying, when we support people's autonomy, we tend to support all three of their basic psychological needs. And in workplaces where those needs are being satisfied, you can see that there's more autonomous motivation for work and an array of positive outcomes that follows from that includes higher general well-being, less distress, more work engagement, and more positive work behavior. Now this was, I think there were 9 countries that samples were drawn from in this. I may be getting these numbers wrong at the moment, but there was no moderation by country. This was something that held up across different nations because the leadership style of autonomy support works everywhere in the world to produce more need satisfaction, more autonomous work motivation, and better outcomes. Well, we can see the importance of need thwarting even on a daily basis. And again, I'm going to draw on a study here that was led by Erica Patel that I really liked. It was a daily diary study of high school science classrooms. And what this study shows, I won't get into the deep detail on it, is on days when teachers gave more choice, when teachers were more focused on student interests, when they gave rationales for what they were engaged in the classroom, and when they asked questions of the students that got at their interests or had them have a sense of input, on those days, the children had more autonomous motivation for science classrooms and were more engaged. And on days when they engaged in other kinds of behaviors like the suppression of questions or controlling messages or engaging in uninteresting activities, there was more controlled motivations on those days. So we can see that the effect of autonomy support is something that fluctuates day to day. With Ulrich Trottwein's group, we did an earlier study in German students that showed that on a given day when a teacher was a little more controlling than he or she usually was, on those days the students would be a little less interested or more interested respectively than they usually were. So this is a very sensitive issue. We are attuned to whether other people are supporting our autonomy or controlling us. We can see this across the world. This is a study that was published in I think the Journal of Adolescence not too long ago. It was a longitudinal study with Chinese 6th and 7th graders. And what the study showed is that when teachers were more autonomy supportive, their students experienced more basic psychological need satisfaction, more autonomy, more competence, and more relatedness in the classroom. And this would lead students to be more engaged in the classroom, and this buffers them against symptoms of depression and anxiety that are so common in this age group. So this is, you can see here, a downstream longitudinal effect of teachers who are supporting autonomy, helping stave off depression and anxiety because they help kids get more engaged in school with that sense of purpose and accomplishment that comes with that. It's not just students who need this, it's teachers who need this as well. And I'm stealing studies from everybody, so I'm stealing one from Haya Kaplan here today that I think we were talking about earlier. But this was a study that they were doing with pre-service teachers. And they had pre-service teachers here who are both Bedouin Muslim teachers and also Israeli teachers or Jewish teachers. And nonetheless, regardless of the group that they come from in the training, if they were experiencing more support for basic psychological needs, they had more sense of accomplishment and more autonomous motivation for the tasks of teaching. And this showed up in more engagement, more self-exploration, and less emotional exhaustion. There were some cultural nuances in this study that I'd encourage you to look at, particularly around the issue of relatedness, but the main effect here is that supporting basic psychological needs, regardless of the background of the teacher, of the pre-service teacher here, was associated with more positive motivational outcomes. We got to do a study in Chinese schools, Chinese public schools. This was with Yu Yan Ni, Biling Chua, and Alex Young and others, where we're looking at the teacher's perception that their principal is supporting their autonomy or their supervisors are supporting their autonomy. And if you substituted teacher and student in this, you would probably get the same kind of result. When principals are supporting teachers' autonomy, the teacher feels, these Chinese teachers reported more intrinsic motivation, more identified motivation, even more introjected motivation because they do not want to disappoint that teacher, that principal who is supporting their autonomy. and less external regulation and less amotivation. So you're seeing more positive forms of motivation when their supervisor or principal is more autonomy supportive, and that shows up in better work outcomes like better job satisfaction, less work stress, and fewer physical symptoms. I do note here that introjection, even though it's positively related to perceived autonomy support, is both related to positively to job satisfaction, but also related to more physical symptoms. So I just think introjection is always an interesting and precarious variable because while it has some benefits, it always carries costs with it, in this case, somatic costs. Getting back to music, this is a study that I don't think is out yet by Paul Evans and Martin van Stinkist. Martin, I think you should get writing wherever he is. But anyway, this is a study of university music students here, and I believe it's a longitudinal study. But I think one of the reasons I wanted to show it here is because it's continuing evidence that in atmospheres where you're getting needs support as opposed to needs frustrated, you have more high-quality motivation. You can see need fulfillment here associated with intrinsic and identified motivation, whereas need frustration being associated more with introjected and external regulation. And those autonomous forms of regulation are associated with greater practice time, higher practice quality, and more agentic engagement in lessons. And this follows up on some earlier work by Evans and Bonneville-Russi showing very similar kinds of results with elite music students. So even in the arts here, we see the same kind of pattern. We see this pattern all the time in sports, and I think we're going to see lots of research like this here in this conference, but in this particular study, this is of Spanish soccer players. We can see that the coaching styles that are more autonomy supportive result in more need satisfaction in the players and more autonomous motivation for playing the sport, and then more commitment to the sport. And this is a pattern we see across the sports sphere where controlling coaching and need thwarting ends up to really produce more amotivation and more withdrawal from sports. It's also something we see in the home environment and families. And again, I'm just going through studies here, but this is a study here that's also a meta-analysis by Vasquez and Patel and others. And what they're looking at is the impact of parental autonomy support on a variety of school outcomes. And what the data here shows is that when parents are more supportive of autonomy, there's greater academic achievement in their children. There's more autonomous motivation for school in their children. These children have greater perceived competence, and they're more engaged, and they have more positive attitudes towards school. So clearly, autonomy support facilitating the internalization of school achievement. And I think it's really, when we think about our children and how we're raising them and how we're helping them thrive, we have to know that it's not just our families who do this. We do this as a system. So this recent data by Dumanis and Zhao and colleagues, I think shows that all of these different players have a role in our children's development. And here they're showing that parental autonomy support, peer autonomy support, and teacher autonomy support are all having an influence on children's need satisfaction, which is affecting their well-being. But parents here, of course, having the largest role. So I'm going to end with this one here, is that even in prison, and this is another study that comes from the Belgian group, even in prison, autonomy support matters. And in this particular study, they're showing that prison guards who are more autonomy supportive in their communication styles will have prisoners who are more likely to internalize the rules of the prison and are more likely to have positive experiences there and be less likely to be defiant. And controlling prison guards are going to lead to more defiance, more reactance, and less internalization. So even in settings that go from home environments and schools to prisons, we see the same pattern of results as a function of motivation. Because it's such a powerful way of influencing behaviors, this is why we've been trying to harness the issues of autonomy support and control, competence support and scaffolding, and relatedness support in interventions that we do. And one sphere that a lot of interventions have been done in SDT is health interventions. And the general model of health interventions runs something as follows, which is if you're going to do a health intervention, you want people to change their behavior, or you think there's something they should take as a prescription. If you communicate that in an autonomy supportive manner, you're likely to have all three needs being more satisfied in the patient or the client, and that's likely to result in greater internalization and likelihood of change. And in fact, some meta-analyses have supported the idea that autonomy-supported behaviors by health practitioners really result in more autonomous engagement in clients, whereas more controlling behaviors by health practitioners don't have that positive effect. This is meta-analysis was done, I think, in 2012 that shows that. And I think this is really important because it shows that the efficacy of our interventions is in part dependent on how it is that we approach people in terms of trying to motivate them. And the result of that has been there's been a lot of very successful health interventions, and the ones that I listed up here are all randomized clinical trials where the efficacy of self-determination theory techniques has been shown with respect to health outcomes, everything from smoking cessation to medication adherence to dental hygiene. The Halvari group, and I think did a series of studies in Norway to show that when dental hygienists communicate the importance of flossing in a more autonomy-supportive way, people are more likely to floss, and if they do floss, they have lower gingivitis, and that's something that's easily detectable. So in many, many different spheres, we can see the importance of an autonomy-supportive approach. And ever since I read that particular study, I've been flossing at least twice a day. So now I'm a clinical psychologist, and this has been my main training and profession has been as a psychotherapist, and so I'm particularly fond of research that goes on in psychotherapy from an SDT perspective, although I must say there hasn't been enough of it. But one of the major hypotheses we have in SDT when we're in the sphere of psychotherapy is that client autonomous motivation is really essential to any maintained change that they're likely to make, even important to their engagement in treatment itself. And so part of the initial activity of any good psychotherapist is not just to start trying to make change happen, but trying to find out from the internal frame of reference of the client, where are you at with respect to changing? Maybe you're not even wanting to. We should start with understanding where you're coming from in that. Now, when people do start with more autonomy, they tend to be more engaged in treatment. And I'm going to an old study here that I got to do with Alan Zelman and Kevin Frisella, where we were working in a methadone maintenance clinic, really, for opiate addicts. And here you can see that, that those patients who had more autonomous motivation for their treatment and who experienced more autonomy support they were better patients in some ways. So if they had more autonomy, they were more likely to stay off drugs, and that meant that they had less positive urine tests when they were tested for that. That meant that they were more likely to show up and attend to group meetings. And one of our outcome variables was what we call a methadone take-home dose, because if you were actually a very compliant client, you didn't have to come in every day to get your methadone or your opiate replacement. You were trusted enough to take it home and not sell it to get street drugs. And so that was a very important outcome. And you can see that ones who had more autonomous motivations were much more likely to attain that status in treatment. We also found that people in the same clinic who reported that their counselors were more autonomy supportive showed less missed sessions, better attendance. They showed less relapse over time, and then they got to that take-home status quicker. This is another study by Carter and Kelly that I think, again, shows the same hypothesis, which is patients with eating disorders and who had more autonomous motivation for engaging in the treatment for eating disorders were more likely to improve over time. That's the symptom checklist that comes from one of the eating disorder questionnaires, and you can see that the high autonomous motivation resulted in quicker change for these patients. It didn't work for all patients in this particular study, but for those with global eating disorders. People with really restrictive anorexia, that can be a whole different set of issues, and we talk about that in a different context here. A second hypothesis about psychotherapy is that no matter what modality you're using, whether you're a short-term psychodynamic therapist or a CBTer or you're somebody who uses pharmacological treatments, but the more autonomy supportive you are, the more likely your clients are going to be to internalize the process of change and maintain that over time. And so one of the best studies that's been out there on that is one that was done, I think, now more than 10 years ago by David Zuroff and colleagues at McGill University, but I think it's quite illustrative. They were looking at treatments for depression, and they were comparing 3 different treatments. One was CBT treatment for depression. The other is an IPT treatment, which is interpersonal therapy for depression. And a third was just managing people with depression on pharmacological treatment, but with counselor management for that. And what they looked at was how autonomy supportive the counselors using each of these techniques were in the treatment of depression. And what their results showed is that when you had a counselor who was more autonomy supportive, the effect size for your outcomes here, the odds ratio of your succeeding in reducing depressive symptoms was 1.95, basically meaning you were twice as effective as an average therapist if you were more autonomy supportive, and 4 times more effective than a controlling therapist at helping depressed patients reduce symptoms over time. So we've written a lot of different articles and takes on this, and other people have written on it too. We think that autonomy support is a cross-modality feature of effective therapy. The more you can be autonomy supportive, no matter what your technique is, the more successful you're likely to be. And our reviews of various therapies shows even therapeutic approaches that don't have any place for autonomy within their theory of change still struggle mightily with how they can get people to be autonomously engaged, and usually have some techniques to do that, even if they don't call them autonomy themselves. So a key to all psychotherapeutic treatments is really an autonomy supportive therapist, and when therapists are autonomy supportive, they're not only likely to aid the internalization process, which is going to produce change, they're also likely to directly satisfy patients' basic psychological needs, and that itself can have some healing quality on them. So both of these things will improve patient engagement and maintain change over time. One of the things that not only psychotherapists use, but I think all of us can use to change in a positive direction is to cultivate our capacity for mindfulness. And it's been now some 2 decades since we introduced the role of mindfulness formally into SDT in our motivation theory. But I think for really since the beginning of our work, Ed and I have argued that awareness is a foundational issue in people engaging in autonomous activities. Basically, we think that awareness is the ground of autonomous functioning, because if you're not aware of what's going on internally and externally, you can't make the choices that are really congruent and really effective in what you're going to do. So that the very idea of choice itself depends upon awareness of the determinants that are influencing you at any given time. And mindfulness supplies a way into this question, and we really started to formally look at this when Kirk Warren Brown came to join us at Rochester as a postdoc, and we developed one of the first measures, self-report measures of mindfulness, called the Mindfulness Awareness and Attention Scale. And we argued with that scale that mindfulness should be a predictor of day-to-day autonomous functioning. And in the 2003 validation article for that scale, we did a couple of studies that were daily diary studies, where we showed not only does trait mindfulness predict more autonomous behavior across time, but moment-to-moment mindfulness predicts the likelihood that you'll be more acting with more autonomy at that moment. So when you're in a mindful state, you're more likely to be able to engage the world in an autonomous way. Now, most recently, we've been expanding on this analysis, and this is a study that is under review right now, but it was led by James Donald, who's now at University of Sydney, and with Emma Bradshaw and Baljinder Chadra and Joseph Chariotchi. We did a meta-analysis of the relationship between mindfulness and each of the motivations that we have in our SDT taxonomy. And I'm just going to start you at the bottom of this. There are 89 relevant studies that we were able to find in the literature where both mindfulness and some form of autonomous motivation was measured. And you can see in the bottom here the scatter diagram, which is The effect size tends to be positive and strong for autonomous motivation, meaning when people are acting with autonomy, they have more mindfulness, or you can put that in reverse. When people are more mindful, they're acting with more autonomy. And yet if you look down at the controlled end, when people are in controlled motivations, they're tending to be low in mindfulness. If you look at up at the top, this is when it's disaggregated into each of the types of motivation in the SDT taxonomy, and you can see the continuum of autonomy at work here. The more controlled or amotivated the motivation, the less mindfulness is entailed in it. The more autonomous forms of motivation integrated and intrinsic motivation more strongly associated with true mindfulness. So we hope that this study will be coming out soon. We also think that mindfulness is really important, not just for autonomous activity, but also just for coping with the stresses that interfere with our self-regulation. The idea behind mindfulness is if they were really aware of both our internal and external states, we can be less threatened by them, we can cope better with the stresses that do befall us. And we've been able to show that in a few studies, and this is an older study that I got to do with Netta Weinstein and Kirk Brown, where basically the data in this study showed that people who are higher in mindfulness will tend to perceive the same stressful situation as less distressing. So they don't put the same kind of catastrophizing into their perception of the world around them. But even with the stresses that they do have, they more actively cope with those stresses. Now, we've been trying to put this into even more microscopic tests, and I want to kind of give you an example of how we might do this. This was a study that I got to do with Patty Schultz, who was a PhD student in our Rochester labs. And we wanted to see how it is that mindfulness helps you deal with the kind of stressors that could befall you. And Patty, who's not here right now, is a particularly mean person. And so in this study, we had people come into a laboratory setting and we put them under a painful condition. And this was a physically painful condition. We had a machine that swirls cold water around in a circle so you could stick your arm in it, and it causes what's called ischemic pain. So the very fact that the water is moving means you can't form a barrier around it, and it quickly gives you a pain in the arm if that's what's inserted into the water. And so in this experiment, people would come into the laboratory setting, and in one condition that we had them put their arm in water and hold it there as long as they could, and they reported how much pain they experienced, and we looked at how long they held it in there, and they took it out. And half of those people, we said, that was great. We're going to do that again later in the experimental session. And to another half of people, they did that, and then they thought that part of the experiment was over and done. And so half of our participants were anticipating a future painful event that was going to befall them within the hour. And then we said, but in the meantime, we have a set of problems for you to solve. And we gave them a difficult cognitive problem that was an estimation problem. And our thinking was that if you're high in mindfulness, even though you're anticipating that there is pain coming, you'll be able to focus on the moment nonetheless. And so you won't be ruminating about the future pain, and because you won't be ruminating, you'll be able to solve that cognitive problem. And that's exactly what we found. We found that, that in the condition where people were anticipating that pain was still forthcoming, they tended to ruminate a lot more because that pain was coming, but the people high in mindfulness did less of that rumination, and this allowed them to do better at the estimation task. And so this teaches a couple things. It shows you how it is that mindfulness can help you deal with the stress that's always befalling us in life. And it also should teach you that you should never come to the University of Rochester and participate in an experiment, because this is what happens to you. Patty, who I did suggest was a really mean person, also did this study with me, which was looking at bad bosses in workplaces. And so in this particular experiment, we were looking, or this is a field study, we're sampling people about their workplaces. And if you have a boss or supervisor who's not very autonomy supportive, this causes or leads to higher need frustration, and need frustration leads to more work ill-being. And what this study showed is that people who are higher in mindfulness, even though they do recognize that they have a non-autonomy supportive boss, don't allow it to frustrate their needs to the same degree, and so they suffer less ill-being as a result of it. So it serves as a buffer, even in a not very positive atmosphere. Now, more recently, we've been trying to embed the important role of mindfulness in the regulation of emotion and behavior into a theory of emotion regulation. And here I've been particularly working with Guy Roth and Martin van Stinkist in a theoretical formulation of this. And we have a paper that's in press right now in developmental psychopathology on this topic. But, and it's a complicated area, but I think, the most simple way I can put this is that when we think about the healthiest form of emotion regulation, when we have emotions, we want to be able to use them informationally. Emotions are an important part of our self-regulatory capacities, and we should be paying attention to them. And mindfulness helps you be aware of what it is that you're feeling. And on top of just being aware of what it is that you're feeling, in a moment of when you need to regulate, you also should be taking interest in what those feelings are so that you can make choices with respect to them. So we think of integrative emotion regulation as really having a couple of steps in it. One is first being in a non-defensive, receptive place of listening to the emotions that are befalling you. Second thing, then taking interest in exploring what the meaning of those emotions might be before you make decisions to act. And if you do those things, then you're in a better position to act with an appropriate degree of autonomy and judgment. So it's going to show increased effectiveness of coping, less defensive processing, and better communication, among other outcomes. Now, one place that this was tested was in a laboratory study that Guy and his colleagues did. Some of you here might have seen this film, The Silence of the Lambs. When I put this slide together, all I had was the picture of the bottom picture there, and Shannon made me put the butterfly picture on top of it because she was too terrified by the bottom picture that was there. Isn't that correct? Yeah, I'm not distorting that. No. So it's a very scary, scary film. And in this laboratory site, it's used a lot to induce fear in people. And so in this laboratory experiment, Guy and company had people come into the lab, and in one condition, they told them just to watch the movie as usual. In another condition, they had them engage in what's called emotional distancing or suppression, which is, try not to experience these emotions, and so distance yourself from these emotions. And this is during the first watching of it. And in a third condition, they applied the integrative emotion regulation strategy, which is feel your emotions and take interest in what they are. So paying attention to your emotions as opposed to trying to suppress, reframe, or push them away, which is the typical cognitive approach to deal with negative emotions. Then they had people come in 72 hours later to watch the film again, and one of the outcomes was how much fear people felt in the second session. So people who went toward their emotions in the integrative emotion regulation strategy actually had less fear the second time through, and better recall for the details of the movie because they weren't preoccupied with the emotion experience. So it shows in a kind of laboratory setting how there are benefits to emotional integration. And when we look at how therapists and people in the world try and deal with negative emotions, it's often, reframe that, or call it something it's not, or recast it as something different. But we think that's not the most important approach to them. The most important approach in self-regulation is listen to your emotions, figure out what they mean. They're not to control you, but they're information that should help you make autonomous decisions subsequently. Now, parents who are autonomy supportive help their children do this, because if you're an autonomy supportive parent, you're listening to your child and you're helping them express their emotion and become more aware of their emotion. So in a way, you're doing the training in integrative emotion regulation if you're an autonomy supportive parent. And this is a longitudinal study that Brenning and Sonens and Van Pittingen did, and Martin van Stinkist at Ghent University. And in this longitudinal study, what they show is that perceived parental autonomy support is associated with more tendency towards emotional integration, and that is itself related longitudinally to more self-esteem in kids, whereas when perceived autonomy support is negatively related to suppressive regulation of emotions, but they in turn are positively related to depression. So the healthy route in emotion regulation is really that of awareness, and autonomy support helps awareness occur. We're in the realm of relationships now, and relationships is a really, I think, wide and deep area of self-determination theory research, and I'm not going to be able to cover a lot of it. Those of you who've been have made it, I don't know how many people in here have read Ed's and my new book. There's at least 3 of you, right? And the three of you who've made it as far as this particular chapter, I know many nights of sleep have intervened in between that. But this is relationships motivation theory, and it's our newest mini theory. And just kind of in a nutshell, relationships motivation theory, first of all, recognizes that relatedness is one of the most important psychological needs that we have. We need to feel that sense of connection and belonging with others everywhere. And yet what it means to have a high quality feeling of connection with others is that that other person appreciates you and yourself and therefore has some element of autonomy support in it. So we think a key element in every high quality relationship in which you really feel connected is that other person supports your autonomy. And finally, one of the tenets of RMT is that it's not just that people give you relatedness or care for you or support your autonomy that helps you feel a high quality relatedness. When you give to them, when you support their autonomy, not only do they benefit, but you benefit as well. So there are reciprocal and synergistic effects of social partners who give to each other in this mutual autonomy supportive way. Now, our research in relatedness has been around for a while, and I just want to kind of go back to a classic study to help illustrate some of the tenets of SDT regarding this. And this is an old study that was led by Jennifer LaGuardia. It came out in the year 2000, and it was really to explore how we have different security of attachment with different social partners in our life. And in this particular study, these were college students, and they were asked, how securely attached are you to your mother, to your father, to your romantic partner, to your best friend, to your roommate, and then there were arbitrary other adult figures. And we used an adult attachment questionnaire to get at this. And you can see here that most college students reported high security of attachment to their mothers and high security of attachment to their best friends. And they reported about the same degree of attachment to their fathers as they did to their arbitrarily assigned freshman roommate. So it's a pretty sad statement for fathers. Not a lot of secure attachment going on around out there. And our theory was that regardless of who the target is, if that target supports your basic psychological needs, you will feel more securely attached to that target. And that's what the data in this showed, that if you were a father who happened to be a father who was autonomy supportive, your kids would be more likely to report being securely attached to you. And if that father also helped you to feel competent and enabled, you'd feel securely attached. The same was true for any of these figures. And if you were a mother who was not autonomy supportive, your child wouldn't be reporting secure attachment to you, because this is a correlation. And those correlations are pretty much the same for all these targets. And this is a central tenet of RMT, which is that what makes you securely attached to somebody else, or one of the things that's afforded in a secure relationship, is that sense that you will be listened to, that someone will care about your perspective, that they won't try and control you, and they'll support your autonomy. Now, this has come out in lots of different studies. What studies have now shown that not just attachment security, but who do you go to when you're in emotional distress, what we call emotional reliance? Who do you turn to at moments of upset or distress or even joy and happiness? And people tend to turn to autonomy support of others. And in addition to emotional expression, to who, this is a study that, again, Jennifer LaGuardia ran, who do you express your emotions to when you're feeling happy, when you're feeling sad? Who do you go to? You go to those people who will take an open ear, understand your frame of reference, support your autonomy, and those are the people you choose. Somebody who's more controlling or judgmental or evaluative, those aren't the people you want to bring your emotions or your distress to, because they're going to tell you what to do, and they may not be able to hear what you've actually experienced. I think very interesting is how the big 5 personality traits vary whether you're with a person who's autonomy supportive or controlling. So we tend to think of the big 5 here, how introverted, how open, how conscientious, how agreeable, and how neurotic we might be, those being the big 5, that those things are traits. But we have a lot of within-person variability in those experiences. So on certain moments, we can be more extroverted or more introverted or more neurotic or less neurotic. And what the data shows is that when you're with people who are autonomy supportive, you tend to be more extroverted rather than introverted. You tend to be more agreeable rather than not, tend to be more open rather than not, tend to be less neurotic rather than not, and whatever the 5th one was. So that these are valenced, that your big five moves in a direction that's associated with higher well-being, because when you're with somebody who's autonomy supportive, you're more feeling like you want to be able to express yourself with them. You have more vitality with them. You have more agreeableness with them. You are more conscientious when you're with them, and you tend to feel less neurotic. So in general, when you're with people who are supporting your autonomy, you feel more vitality in that relationship, more satisfaction in that relationship. So that's why it's a really key element within RMT. And when we can be really open with other people, when we can be our true selves with them, so to speak, when we can express what's actually going on for us rather than concealing what's going on, it can be more need satisfying. And this is a study by a team that's been really doing some wonderful studies, I think, in partner and relationship studies. But you can see here the path model in which self-concealment, hiding things from your partner, is associated with lower basic psychological need satisfaction. If you have to hide things from your partner, you're going to feel less autonomy satisfaction, less competence satisfaction, less relatedness satisfaction when you're with them. And that's going to lead to lower quality sense of the commitment to the relationship and satisfaction of the relationship itself. So we've been writing about this recently, and I got to write a paper with Will Ryan not too long ago on this topic, which is what we were calling the topic of authenticity. And authenticity is a topic that's often equated with the idea of autonomy, and they are very closely related. Authenticity is most commonly used in the existential phenomenological literature, and it really conveys the idea not only that you're autonomous, and when you're authentic, you're doing a thing willingly, but also that you're congruent, you're being true to yourself. And when you're in an interpersonal setting, if you're an authentic person, you're also being genuine. You're being who you really are, and you're not hiding aspects of yourself. So authenticity has always been treated as a good thing, but most of the time in the existential literature, we tend to think of it as an individual difference. Some people are authentic and other people are not that authentic. But what Will and I were writing about is that there's also a social psychology to this, which is that there are social situations that drive us to be not authentic with other people because we don't feel like we can be open with them. And so one of the places that's been explored a lot is with respect to LGB samples. And this is particularly here, I want to give a shout out to Nikki Legate, who's run most of the studies from our lab on this, and Netta Weinstein and others. LGBT people face a constant question about how much to conceal or how much to show themselves in different kinds of social settings. So we have reasoned that that LGBT people will be less likely to be out or transparent about their sexual identity and their just general lifestyle when they're in settings that are less autonomy supportive. And that's turned out to be the case. This was a study that Nikki ran where we asked people, how out are you in different atmospheres in your life or different contexts of your life? How out are you with your family, friends, co-workers, or peers, or your religious community? And we see that there's variations in how out people are. That outness correlates 0.67 with how they rate those settings as autonomy supportive. So people tend to be more out in settings where there's more sense of autonomy support. And when they can be out in settings and feel that autonomy support, they have better mental health. And just as an example of that, we can see here that in a setting where you feel like there's high support for autonomy, you can have less depression and also be out. So generally, outness is associated with better mental health, but it's not as positively associated with better mental health if you're not in an autonomy supportive settings. There, you'll still suffer. Now, we recently did a much more in-depth study of this with the LGBT population in Rochester, New York, where it was a daily diary study. And over a couple-week period, we were able to track all the social interactions that people had during the day, all the significant social interactions, and how much they experienced the person around them as autonomy supportive. And in this LGBT population here, they were much less likely to be easy with their identity or disclosing if they were around more controlling people. And that they paid a cost for that in terms of mental health, in terms of well-being, and also physical symptoms like headaches, stomach aches, backaches, and other symptoms of stress. Now, we've been looking at this relationship stuff in many different ways, and I just want to kind of get at some of the kind of new methods that we can use in SDT to be looking at quality of relationships. And this is a study that we're just preparing for a write-up now that came out of our labs in Australia. that is led by Stefano Di Domenico. And there we have a set of equipment that's called spectroscopy. We call it FNIRS. So this is a device where you're shooting basically infrared light through the skull, and you can pick up on blood activation in the prefrontal cortical area, so you can see what parts of your brain are being activated during different kinds of activities. And now, one of the things that's been noted in the neuropsychological studies is that when you are thinking or you're accessing information about yourself, for instance, you're rating yourself on trait variables or something like that, there's a particular part of your brain that becomes pretty activated. Here it's called the medial prefrontal cortical area, or Brodmann's area. This area will be a lot more activated when you're thinking about yourself, as for instance, you're thinking about other figures like a political figure. You're thinking about what's the case of the sentence here, is it capitals or lowercase? When you're thinking about non-self-related objects, there's less activation in this particular area. So another way of putting that is the medial prefrontal cortical areas are preferenced when you're accessing self-related information. So Stefano had read some ideas that we had about when other people are really need-satisfying to you, you integrate them into your sense of self. And you thought, well, if that's true, if you have a need-satisfying partner, maybe when you think about that partner, it will similarly activate the medial prefrontal cortical areas. In other words, you'll be accessing the same part of your brain that you would be if you were accessing self-related information. So we were testing this hypothesis, basically, that there'd be more similarity in medial prefrontal cortical activation when you're you're thinking about a friend who's need supportive. And so we measured how need supportive your friends were in different ways. We controlled for relationship length and general fulfillment of basic psychological needs, and put people through a paradigm where they were thinking about a word that either described them or described this friend. And we knew how autonomy supportive or controlling this friend would be. And what the results showed is that if you have a friend who's highly needs supportive, it was similar activity in terms of medial prefrontal cortical activation when you thought about them. But if they were controlling, there was a significant difference between the medial prefrontal cortical activation when you thought about them versus yourself. So that differential preference shows up particularly when you're thinking about controlling others. So these are just ways to kind of get at something that we think there's a deep science to all of these claims that we make in SDT, even though we tend to use a lot of self-report to get at it sometimes. I want to turn to my last topic here. What's this? Yeah, so I'm out of time. Which is just the general notion of well-being. And so when we think about well-being, the general SDT model is that when we have our needs satisfied, we have higher well-being. When we have our needs frustrated, we have lower well-being. And that's turned out to be the case all over the world. And it's turned out to be the case on a daily basis. On moments or days when you have your needs satisfied, you have higher well-being and less physical symptoms than on other days. We see that it's a universal thing. For some time, Hazel Marcus and other people were claiming that autonomy didn't matter to the well-being of people who were in Asia, but that's not the case. Here's a meta-analysis by you by you. That actually shows that there's really no significant difference in the association of autonomy and subjective well-being, whether you're in an East Asian context or a US context. So these things are showing something about the universality of it. And I say, well, you can also look at this on the dark side. People who aren't having need satisfaction are also more likely to have depression, anxiety, and even suicidal ideation. So this is one of the studies by Breton and others who showed that one standard deviation lower in need satisfaction puts you at 50% more risk for suicidal ideation. So the same things that make life worth living when we're deprived of them make life not so great. So we've tended to, when we think about well-being, we think about what makes for a life that's really worth living. It's a life that is eudaimonic. And here we're using the Aristotelian notion that a eudaimonic life is where we pursue a life of excellence and virtue, and because he at least hypothesized that those would be the things that would deeply satisfy us and make us happy. And here we would not be pursuing happiness. It would just be an outcome of our pursuing a virtuous life. Now, we get lots of other messages that say this is not the way we should live. We should be consuming, we should be buying, we should be doing things that bring us status and power. But that's not the Aristotelian message anyway. That would be pursuing things that have more inherent meaning for us. So really back in the 90s, we started to explore this with our aspirations, our general cause, our GCT theory, which is goal content theory. And our theory was basically that if you had certain kinds of life goals, they could get you to wellness if they satisfied your basic psychological needs, but some life goals would fail to satisfy those needs. And we divided needs into different types. So we had some types that were intrinsic goal types that we thought would inherently satisfy basic psychological needs, and some we classified as extrinsic life goals. And just to give some examples of that, on the extrinsic life goals, it was things like fame, image, and money. If those were the things you were pursuing, we thought even if you get those things, those won't necessarily gratify your basic psychological needs, and so they won't add to your wellness. But the pursuit of personal growth or meaningful relationships or giving in your community, these things would inherently satisfy basic psychological needs and lead to greater wellness if you pursued them. Now, lots of data has supported this. This was our first study that was done in an urban center where we found that people who put more emphasis on intrinsic goals had more self-actualization, more vitality, fewer depressive symptoms, and fewer physical symptoms. And the opposite was true of people pursuing extrinsic goals. And this idea that it's mediated by basic psychological needs has also been borne out in research. This is a more recent study by Nishimura, who shows in a Japanese population that intrinsic aspirations are positively associated with basic psychological need satisfaction and then with life satisfaction, where the opposite is true of extrinsic goals. And I keep pressing the wrong button here. This has been shown in Chile, in the UK, here materialism predicting need satisfaction and frustration with the associated life outcomes coming from this. In fact, at this point in time, this set of results has been replicated in dozens and dozens of nations and in most every age group and across different occupational fields. I just want to show you some new research that Frank Martella and Emma Bradshaw and I have been pursuing, where our idea is that this dimension of intrinsic to extrinsic is just that. It's a dimension, and you can map anything along this dimension. So in this research, we threw in some new goals. We threw in goals for having mastery in your life. We threw in safety. We threw in power as a goal. And we can see that they array themselves along the axis here such that wanting power over other people, it's a strongly extrinsic aspiration, whereas safety turned out to be a highly intrinsic aspiration. And we even did some other kinds of analysis where this is a network analysis using a spin glass algorithm here, in which you can visually array the interconnection between people's life aspirations. And it shows you something that you can't get from just the dimensional look. And you see here, for instance, that power, which is deeply embedded in the extrinsic side of value systems, is really associated with this desire for money, is also concerned with image and popularity, because those are the characteristics that power pulls on. But at the same time, if you're interested in safety, that's also closely connected to financial interests. So these kinds of analyses suggest that there's a lot of future research where we can go well beyond the aspirational set that we've been looking at before, using new methods to map out how they relate to one another. And I'll just say Emma Bradshaw has been working on another paper that has now been endlessly under review at JPSP for I don't know how many years at the same journal. And here we're looking at people's life aspirations and goals. And we start out with the idea that most of us really care about this person who's in the middle of our social network, meaning ourselves. But some people care about even a wider social network. They care about their family and their kin and the people who are close to them. But there's still other people who care even about a wider circle. They care about their community and their country and other people. And there's still people who might have a wider set of care and concern for instance, not just your own country, but all people in the world. And there are people who even have concerns beyond all people in the world to all living things and our nature and our environment. And what the data is showing is that the wider your integrative span, the more you care about, the more you identify with, the more you bring into that sphere of care, the higher your well-being. So these are some new directions that I think we're going with some of the aspiration work that we're doing. And would go on with some stuff about pro-social and anti-social stuff, but I'm out of time. So I'm simply going to tell you that we're exploring a very general model that says when you find yourself in social situations, whether those be families, societies, workplaces that are supporting your basic psychological needs, you're just much more prone to be pro-social in your activity. And when you're pro-social in your activity, that's going to lead you to much deeper need satisfaction of autonomy, competence, and relatedness needs, and that's going to lead to higher well-being. And this gets me to my very last topic, I promise, and that's that as we think about the societal influence on us, we have to go beyond what we've been studying in SDT, where we tend to study proximal relationships. We study managers and their employees, or teachers and their students, or parents and their children. But we're also influenced by the pervasive atmospheres that we find ourselves in, the political and economic systems in which we reside. You know, I'm a U.S. citizen, and you can imagine that in the U.S. there are many things that our government and that our system does that are not supporting of people's basic psychological needs. For instance, we don't have a universal health care system. And people who can't afford health care suffer in many ways in terms of basic psychological needs because of the absence of this social good. So we've been more interested recently in how it is that pervasive social factors are affecting people's wellness. So for instance, Stefano Di Domenico and Fournier did some work showing that it's not just your income, of course, will help you satisfy some basic psychological needs and lead to better happiness, but income inequality is frustrating to basic psychological needs. So if you're in a country where there's more income inequality, or a state with more income inequality, you will have more frustrated basic psychological needs. We've been studying this even at a broader level. If we look at about economic theories like the theory of capabilities, Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have argued that part of what makes for a good society and people's ability to live a good and eudaimonic life is that they have certain resources and capabilities available to them so they can pursue the things that really matter. So just looking at this idea, Cody DeHaan and led a investigation where we looked at Martha Nussbaum's list of capabilities and looked at how those affected well-being as mediated by basic psychological needs. And what the results showed is that Nussbaum's list of 10 capabilities, the things that are important to pursue what matters, do matter, but they matter mostly because they're things that enhance our capacity for basic psychological needs. And most recently, we've been here it's not only Cody, but also Randy Curran and Emma Bradshaw and Phil Parker, and I have been looking at Rawls' theory of social justice. And Rawls, in his theory of social justice, says a good society is one where there's fairness and distribution of goods in such a way as people can pursue the things that really matter to them. And for him, the fair distribution of social goods included that there'd be some reasonable distribution of wealth, that there'd be some availability of opportunities to everyone, that there'd be liberty and privileges that would be equally afforded to all people, and that there'd be some basis of self-respect so you didn't have to fear stigma and prejudice on a daily basis. And we've been looking at these things that are called, he calls them primary goods, these essentials in a good society. And we can see here that primary goods do have an impact on people's well-being, but largely as it's mediated by basic psychological needs. So in other words, if we have societies that give us freedom and give us resources, it allows us to feel that autonomy and feel that competence and to form those connections that give us a life that really matters. So SDT is a pretty broad theory. I haven't been able to give you any kind of complete view of SDT. There's so many things I didn't get to talk about today that I would have loved to, but it's a theory that spans research all the way from the microscopic level of neuroscience and psychophysiology all the way up, I think, importantly, to the pervasive level of our political and economic systems and how they influence us. And so, you know, in a nutshell, I think it's a pretty good theory, and the nutshell is it's simply that there's a heck of a lot more work to do. So thank you very much.